Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's James Acton. I'm co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I just want to say welcome to you all for this afternoon's event. I'm going to hand over in just a sec to our moderator. I just want to say, firstly, a very warm congratulations to Fiona Cunningham, who's here for the the Carnegie launch of her book, Under the Nuclear Shadow. Fiona, in my mind, is one of the most brilliant and insightful commentators on China's nuclear weapons and its other forms of strategic weapons. Fiona wrote at least part of this book while she was a Stanton Fellow at Carnegie 4 years ago now? Was it pre-pandemic? That was right. I remember because you spent some of the time in Australia incredibly gamely getting up for Zooms at like 3 o'clock in the morning Australia time. Because that was daytime over here. It's wonderful to see this book come out. It's an incredibly insightful, fascinating read. So I encourage everyone to go and buy copies outside and then to embarrass Fiona by asking her to sign them at the end of today's talk. Let me also hand over, first of all, to the moderator for today's meeting, Pranay Vaddi. Pranay is another ex-Carnegie person who went on to bigger and better things afterwards. Specifically, before he joined Carnegie, Pranay was in the State Department. Recently, towards the end of the Biden administration, he was senior director on the National Security Council for Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation. The fact that the Trump administration has not named a successor for him, in my mind, can only be because he did the job so well that there is literally nothing left to do on arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation. Pranay is currently affiliated with MIT, where he is taking a very well-deserved intellectual break after exceptionally hard work on the National Security Council. So Pranay, let me welcome you and your co-panelists to the stage and just say thank you very much to all of you for being here today. And Pranay will introduce everybody on the panel. Sure.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, James, for that kind introduction. I want to introduce our panelists briefly, but first let me just share a few thoughts on Fiona's book, why I think it's such an important contribution to our discourse and analysis. As many people know, Washington is hotly debating what to do about China's nuclear buildup. That crosses into arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament, nuclear posture, nuclear policy conversations taking place in the government and outside. Some who, like the Strategic Posture Commission, note that U.S. strategy should no longer consider China to be a lesser included threat and are calling for an increase in the nuclear force in the United States as well as the conventional forces. Many officials have noted that the significance of China's buildup occurring right now as the New START treaty is due to expire next year creates added pressure for these conversations that are taking place within the U.S. government. The discourse has tended to focus on the shifting strategic nuclear equation between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, and all three combined. And those numerical comparisons, the trying to find the perfect number, are always going to occupy the debate that's taking place here. What Fiona's book does, actually, is helps us understand China's strategic rationale. This isn't just a math problem. We need to understand China's foreign policy goals, the dilemmas that Beijing has been responding to over the past couple of decades, and the relevance of nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence, and information age capabilities to how they see the world and their near abroad. I think this book will be a really critical contribution. It'll help educate U.S. policymakers, academics, and experts worldwide on understanding Chinese thinking on these issues today. And most importantly, I think that for decision makers who occupy the current administration here in the United States, as well as the leadership in China and Russia, there's going to be tough decisions to make on arms control and future nuclear posture formulations, and so this analysis is absolutely critical and timely. And Fiona, I just want to congratulate you for publishing this. I think you appropriately bring the focus on this limited war dilemma that has motivated so many of the changing characteristics of China's nuclear buildup, as well as everything else they're doing to advance strategic capabilities. You highlight for readers where these important debates occurred within Beijing in a way that I don't think we've been able to see in such a concise way in unclassified publications to date, and those critical moments throughout history where these debates occurred: 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, Belgrade bombing, reactions to US policy statements and nuclear posture reviews. And so I'm very happy to be here to moderate the panel. And without further ado, let me introduce our panelists and then turn it over to Fiona. So I want to applaud Mallory Stewart, seated furthest away from me, for joining as a discussant today. She was the Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability in the Biden administration, as well as my predecessor at the National Security Council. And before that, she served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Arms Control Bureau under the Obama administration and has served as a lawyer at the State Department Office of the Legal Advisor since 2002. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow with the Nuclear Policy Program in Carnegie, China, which is our former Carnegie, I keep forgetting, Carnegie's East Asia-based research center on contemporary China. He was formerly based in Beijing and now conducts his research in Washington on strategic security issues. He's long been an expert on Chinese nuclear thinking, is a great collaborator, and I welcome him to the panel as well. Finally, Fiona Cunningham, a non-resident scholar here at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment, as James introduced her previously. She's made an excellent contribution with this book, and I look forward to seeing her succeed and continue to advance the discourse on China nuclear issues. With that, let me turn it over to Fiona, and anything that you'd like to say up front about your book, and then we will move to moderated Q&A.
Super. So I want to start by thanking both Pranay and James for your warm congratulations as well as welcome. It's an honor to be in the company of my fellow panelists, Tong and Mallory as well. I'm very grateful to the Nuclear Policy Program for hosting this event. And as James alluded to, it's very meaningful for me to be able to speak about my book here, given the fact that some of the key outstanding questions and lingering issues with this manuscript clicked into place while I was a Stanton Fellow here at Carnegie. So thank you to James, to Toby, to George, and to NPP colleagues, both past as well as present. In my remarks, there are three things that I want to do. The first is that I'm going to introduce three big ideas in the book that I think makes the case for why China's approach to strategic deterrence is different. The second thing is I want to outline a little bit of how China's approach has evolved over time, and then offer some thoughts on what the future holds for China's strategic deterrence, building on the conclusion of the book, but hopefully will help launch our discussion as a panel. So they think there are three big ideas in this book. The first is this idea of a limited war dilemma, which is the problem at the core of the book, strategic substitution, which is the solution to that problem, and information age weapons which implement that solution. And you can think of them as the why, what, and how of China's distinctive approach to strategic deterrence. So the first idea is the limited war dilemma that Pranay briefly mentioned in his opening remarks. This book, I think, is about a central problem that all nuclear-armed states, when they're facing a nuclear-armed adversary, which is how can they still continue to use their military capabilities to achieve political objectives, to coerce their adversaries without triggering what would be a catastrophic nuclear war. And I want to emphasize that no state has actually managed to solve this dilemma. We have two kind of traditional options that most states have selected, which involves threatening the first use of nuclear weapons or threatening a decisive conventional victory against one's opponents, which is backed by nuclear forces that would deter an adversary from overturning that victory by escalating to the nuclear level. And all of these options have their advantages and disadvantages. Neither of them are a silver bullet. But this does raise the question of what happens when you have a country that is sensitive to the disadvantages of both of them. And that was China's situation. It did not view nuclear threats against a nuclear-armed adversary as credible, and it was so conventionally inferior to the United States 25 years ago when it began to sort of grapple with this dilemma that it would have been decades before it had really been able to select that conventional option. And so it didn't adopt either of these answers to the limited war dilemma. And that leads to the second key idea of strategic substitution. And this is the third option that China created for coping with the limited war dilemma. At its core, strategic substitution involves threatening to use non-nuclear weapons to escalate a conflict that can have strategic effects and change the calculations of an adversary decision maker. But pairing those non-nuclear strategic attacks with a retaliatory nuclear posture. And so what the combination there does is that it enables a state to increase the risk of escalation in a conflict, including up to the nuclear level, but without actually having to threaten to use its nuclear weapons first. In fact, it actually dares the adversary to be the first one to use nuclear weapons in response to these provocative non-nuclear attacks. And strategic substitution was appealing to China because it offered quick and credible coercive leverage, in contrast to the decades that it would need to redress the conventional balance, or imbalance, I should say, with the United States, and was preferable to the first use of nuclear weapons, which was a more difficult option to make credible. The third big idea in the book is that of information age weapons, which I argue could be used as substitutes in this strategic substitution approach because they promise to provide coercive leverage against nuclear-armed adversaries. And by information age weapons, I'm talking about conventional missiles that are used in a precision strike capacity, relying on information networks to be guided to their targets, as well as counterspace and offensive cyber operations that disrupt an adversary's satellites and computer networks, respectively. Some, but not all of these weapons have the capacity to generate strategic effects because they can threaten large-scale damage against an adversary, its military, its society, its allies that's difficult to defend against. They cross key escalation thresholds in limited wars between nuclear powers. And perhaps most importantly, they share technology with nuclear weapons. So they're entangled, if you like, to use James's term, with nuclear weapons in ways that generate inadvertent nuclear escalation risks if you choose to use them. But to generate coercive leverage, these weapons, you can't just possess them, you actually have to posture your capabilities, so as well as your doctrine, your organization, and even your signaling to an adversary in ways that optimize those components to generate coercive leverage. And China pursued a large, its precision conventional missile force after the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, and counter-space weapons and offensive cyber operations after the United States accidentally bombed China's embassy in Belgrade in 1999 during the Kosovo Air War, an incident that China's leaders to this day do not accept was an accident. So how has China's approach to the use of these information age weapons evolved over time? I think three aspects are worth highlighting, although there's more than that in the book. It's many pages long. First is that strategic substitution emerged from leverage deficits that China experienced because of crises with the United States over these two incidents I just mentioned of Taiwan and the Belgrade embassy bombing. And these crises alerted China's leaders to the fact that if there was a future Taiwan crisis, they were going to either fight a war that they were going to lose, or they would have to make humiliating diplomatic concessions if they didn't go about some way generating more coercive leverage and augmenting the military capabilities that they had in ways that would make crises in the future more dangerous and costly for US leaders. But China's choice of strategic substitution took place at a time when its nuclear and its conventional capabilities were significantly weaker than they are today. The second thing that's worth pointing out about the evolution of these capabilities is that China's coercive force postures for its three information age weapons evolved over time. After the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, China sought a conventional missile force that was going to be large, precise, and could target US bases in East Asia. But initially, it lacked the precision strike capability, both in terms of accuracy and the sensors to support it, to be able to carefully calibrate escalation in the way it used its conventional missiles. The real turning point came around 2013 when it started to deploy more accurate missiles and better sensing capabilities. And here you can think of the DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile of kind of emblematic of that change. And after that point, PLA doctrinal writings about how China would use these capabilities started to shift from describing both military and civilian targets for these attacks to military-only ones. China's cyber force posture also evolved over time from one that really exacerbated the risk of uncontrolled escalation, what I call a brinkmanship posture, to one that tried to tame them. And this occurred, I think, fairly abruptly between the years of 2012 and 2014, as China's leaders decided to exert a lot more control and centralize the command structure for their cyber capabilities. But this shift is not a technological story. This is one instead about leaders feeling greater vulnerability to cyber attacks themselves because China rapidly digitized as a society, a military, and a government. And therefore that forced in some ways China's leaders to really want to control the use of those capabilities more carefully. The final point on the evolution is one of the reasons why China's postures evolved is related to US countermeasures. So China's conventional missile force, I think, is one of the biggest headaches for military planners here in Washington, as well as in the Indo-Pacific and in the region itself. But its leverage might actually end up being relatively fleeting as the United States shed the constraints of the INF Treaty and is seeking to counter China's advantages by deploying similar capabilities in the region. In the cyber domain, in the last 8 years or so, the US has also begun to rethink this problem from being one of a cyber Pearl Harbor it would have to prepare for being really more like a death by 1,000 cuts from lower level cyber attacks under the threshold of armed conflict. So in preparing for that different way of thinking about the effects of cyber challenges, this has robbed China of some of the coercive leverage it would otherwise have from threatening a cyber Pearl Harbor, but also has enabled the US to develop tools and techniques to disrupt Chinese preparations for cyber attacks before they're actually executed in peacetime. In space, the United States is changing its satellite architecture from one based on big, juicy target type of satellites to one that complements those satellites with those that are of lower value and are smaller, that blunts the leverage China could gain from any individual anti-satellite weapon. And China is also now concerned that the US is developing the full suite of its own counterspace capabilities as well. So what does the future hold for China's strategic substitution approach? I think on the one hand, China's information age weapons haven't necessarily lived up to the promise that its leaders saw in them back 25 years ago when they started to develop them. And perhaps we can't blame them because these were often relatively nascent technologies, nascent changes in the way that society was using some of them. So they can be forgiven for overhyping perhaps the leverage they would get. But in other cases, China actually did succeed in gaining coercive leverage, only to see that blunted by US countermeasures within that time frame. China's nuclear and conventional capabilities have also improved out of sight in the past decade, which is going to make any of those traditional options a little bit more appealing than they were in 1995. But on the other hand, I think it's worth pointing out some limits to those modernization campaigns. China's conventional capabilities, I don't think yet can threaten a decisive victory in a Taiwan contingency in which the United States intervenes. It may be much more of a kind of stalemated or no clear winner. And there's a pretty high bar that states need for their conventional capabilities to really rely upon them for coercive leverage. I also, perhaps more controversially, don't see China's nuclear modernization as evidence that it is seeking a first-use nuclear strategy that spells the end of strategic substitution. Yes, that modernization is going to enable China to make more credible threats of first use because it's a larger force, it has better theatre forces and sits at a higher state of readiness. But I do ask, where are the tactical nuclear weapons with nuclear armaments for China? Why hasn't it changed its no first use policy if it really wants to get the maximum out of a first use posture? Where is the evidence of an operational doctrine for the first use of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict? And is there evidence that China now has more confidence that threatening nuclear first use against a nuclear-armed adversary would be credible, which is precisely the calculation or the doubts that China's leaders previously had that pushed them towards strategic substitution? There's ongoing ambiguity over China's motivations for its nuclear modernization, but I'm relatively convinced that both US capabilities and strategy, as well as the pursuit of political effects that having a bigger and better arsenal might have on US decision-making, as some of Tong's work has shown, especially in a Taiwan contingency, are key reasons for it. But thus far, I think that China's nuclear buildup is actually responding to different problems than a search for coercive leverage. So although China might have a better grip on the limits of strategic substitution, it still doesn't appear to have found a better option. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks for that, Fiona. So I will take the privilege of being moderator to ask a few questions, and then we will come to the audience both here and watching on YouTube. So I guess my first couple of questions, Fiona, I'll start with you, and then I would appreciate Tong and Mallory weighing in too. First, I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through one of these limited war scenarios, and it can involve fictional countries if you wish. I'm trying to better understand what will make these what about China's approach to strategic deterrence, including these information age capabilities, do you find will make U.S. decisions to escalate or not more difficult? There's a certain amount of ambiguity that comes with using these information age capabilities, but they also run the risk of, incidentally striking what the U.S. considers to be a strategic asset or a vital interest, depending on the type of capability used and depending on the type of target it's used against. So imagine counterspace attacks or attacks against allied cyber infrastructure. What do you see in this approach that makes that decision-making here in Washington very fuzzy? And then I guess, relatedly, what are the sort of biggest risks of the PRC's approach to inadvertent escalation?
So I think what makes this calculation in some ways difficult for Washington is that the way China thinks about deploying some of these capabilities, and you see described in the doctrine that, for example, China would engage in large-scale cyber attacks on US critical infrastructure on the homeland. Or that it might think about attacking counterspace assets, some of which are in lower orbits, which may be particularly important for the way that the US thinks about its conventional strike capabilities. You see a little bit less about China basically thinking about attacking assets that are specifically designed to limit the US's use of its own nuclear weapons, so its NC3 assets, for example, although it certainly is starting to, I believe, develop capabilities that would enable it to target those systems as well. And I think what's difficult, or what the sort of logic or the underlying piece of China's thinking about strategic substitution is here, is that there's still a decision that has to be made by a country to respond to these provocative attacks, to use nuclear weapons first or to initiate nuclear threats. And the gamble in some ways of strategic substitution is actually that there's a bluff. An adversary is not going to be willing to fight a nuclear war for those, for whatever it is that's at stake in the Indo-Pacific. And so if you attack these kinds of assets, it's going to be very provocative, but it is not going to necessarily generate the response of an adversary using its nuclear weapons first. So China's trying to essentially drive the US right up to that nuclear threshold, but get it to be the one that backs down because it's not willing to cross that bright line and use nuclear weapons first or even start to initiate the nuclear threats. So the fuzzy decision-making, I think, for Washington in this situation is, how many of these high-value assets do you absorb damage to? Are there other ways in which you can deter them than threatening the first use of nuclear weapons? What stakes are actually at play in an Indo-Pacific conflict, and how are they going to change over the course of a conflict if a country like China is starting to erode some of these key aspects of US military power, if it's attacking bases in allied countries, if it's engaging in the use of force against the US homeland, even with these non-kinetic strikes. That in and of itself can sort of change the stakes of a conflict as well, from being just about, let's say, the defense of Taiwan to ones where it really starts to become about responses to the damage that China is inflicting on China throughout the course of a conflict. So I see that that's kind of the dilemma that China is thinking through. Obviously, the use of some of these capabilities can also damage US nuclear supporting assets. China itself doesn't have a counterforce doctrine, is my understanding, and so they might look at that and say, well, you can't say just because we have offensive cyber operations or because we have counterspace weapons that the design here is actually to diminish your ability to use nuclear weapons first. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the US isn't going to look at weapons that can be retargeted, weapons where you can't necessarily observe what it is that they're targeting, or in the case of cyber operations, even see where your assets have been compromised and be able to react in a relatively measured manner. So I think the real question for the US and its allies in thinking about how to respond to strategic substitution is how to avoid sort of taking the bait of thinking of this as a nuclear escalation scenario and finding ways to sort of fight through these provocative attacks without diminishing their ability to fight conventional operations, but also without escalating to the nuclear level, because then the logic of strategic substitution starts to fall flat, because China has to come up with a plan B if these attacks don't have the intended effect.
Thanks for that. Tong, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I think this research really helps us trace the evolution of China's strategic security thinking. I think Fiona, is among one of the first scholars to actually do the cutting-edge research, look at China's traditional thinking on escalation, which is China generally dismisses nuclear, the risk of crossing the nuclear threshold, and dismisses the possibility of managing escalation once the nuclear threshold is crossed. And then her most recent research reflects, I think, increasing Chinese interest over the past couple of decades at least to becoming more interested in understanding escalation dynamics and managing escalation. This limited war dilemma, I think, reflects China's deeper thinking on managing military escalation. And the Chinese solution, as Fiona identified, reflects a general strategy. I think there is actually some similarity between Chinese and Western approach, which is you want to give yourself more options, more freedom, more flexibility, so you add more rungs to the escalation ladder. So you add more tools that allow you to respond in various scales or intensity to different levels of conflicts. So you see China starting with nuclear level deterrence capability, and then prioritizing non-nuclear strategic weapons or information age weapons. And then when China's money and resources allows China, focus more on the lower end, the general purpose conventional capabilities. So nowadays it has full spectrum flexibility. And I think that's not that dissimilar to Western approach, which means managing escalation, including conventional all the way to all-out nuclear war, is going to be more important in China-US or China-West military competition. I think this research definitely helps us really understand that dynamic much better. I think when both sides, US and China, now thinking about escalating, managing escalation, it certainly gives us both challenges and opportunities. Opportunities in the sense that we both understand the risk of uncontrolled escalation, as Fiona identified. Initially, Chinese weapons were not good enough, so China couldn't really control the escalation risk. But over time, China becomes both more capable and also more willing to tailor the escalation risk. So the challenge becomes how do we reach basic understandings of what certain actions are more escalatory or less escalatory, what are each other's escalation thresholds or red lines. I think that offers opportunities for more in-depth discussions. But on the other hand, when both sides now more committed to managing escalation, increasing one's own advantage in managing escalation, that also drives new arms race dynamics. I think this is, that's why I think everyone will really need to read Fiona's book to understand what future US-China competition is going to look like.
Yeah, it goes without saying, read and cite the book. We're all going to be doing that, I think, in the coming months. Mallory, anything you want to chime in on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what has been said, and especially the fact that Fiona has taken an issue that really did need investigation and looked at primary sources, looked at policy that hasn't been looked at comprehensively by the US government or US commentators ever. And I think that was really important and something that we need to focus on going forward. What I sort of take from the question, Pranay, was sort of the risks involved in some of this efforts to manage escalation, some of these efforts to use strategic substitution to avoid potentially a nuclear conflict from being the automatic outcome of spiraling conflicts. And I think one of the risks is an over-reliance on the effort to understand escalation. And I think Fiona points that out quite well, is that with these strategic substitutions, there's an assumption that China sort of takes on that it can push the US to sort of the edge, not force them over sort of the nuclear precipice and not force them to sort of use a nuclear response to a non-nuclear challenge. But there's an assumption that, yes, we can use cyber weapons, we can use sort of precision strike and our space weapon capability to leverage the US in a way that will prevent a nuclear war, but will also make them feel vulnerable to our persuasion. And I think the risk there is that escalation management and escalation dynamics is constantly in flux, right? And your point that I think is very well conveyed in the book, there's an arms race in strategic substitution. There's an arms race in escalation management. There's constantly a desire to minimize the leverage of potential adversaries through these alternative options. And so we see the massive proliferation of space architectures with numerous satellites to defeat a potential direct descent destructive ASAT capacity that China has demonstrated. We see the US building up cyber defenses and trying to sort of, in the arms race of the cyber arena, try to always stay a step ahead with respect to defenses. And I think the challenge is when a country so focuses on managing escalation dynamics without the potential equivalent reliance on understanding the other side's response, understanding the other side's engagement, or the point you also make very well, the entanglement challenge, right? If we don't know if this satellite is purely for conventional purposes or has a nuclear C3 element to it, can we truly say that targeting that satellite will not cross a threshold that we did not anticipate in advance? And I think that is why, and your book concludes, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I think it does make a really good point that our arms control efforts, our risk reduction efforts have to evolve to take into account the escalatory management challenge that China has now gotten its head around and thinks perhaps that it's really understanding in an arena which is very challenging to understand, right? Because there is no really fulsome direct government-to-government engagement. And I think that is a risk that is implied, if not directly stated in your book, that needs to be more comprehensively addressed by both governments going forward.
And Mallory, you will be the lead-off hitter on a risk reduction question that is coming up, so we can dive into that a little bit more. One thing I wanted to touch upon, though, that all three of you have pointed to but not said directly is all of this book is being published and is available for people to read now. Everything that's happening in the U.S. government, I mean, all of this is happening in the context of the United States, China, Russia, many of our European allies, many of our Asian allies, seeing the risk of limited war between nuclear powers as increasing, right? I mean, they're not being scientific about it. I'm just stating what I think is obvious and something that the Chinese detected in the early 90s, and as a result, and thanks to your research, you've helped explain why they've made certain investments and developed certain capabilities all the way through to today. But from a U.S. perspective, the United States is looking at the possibility that conflict could emerge in Europe with Russia, for example, and then either at the same time or in the near aftermath, having to potentially deal with conflict emerging in China, perhaps a Taiwan Strait crisis that unfortunately trips into a conflict, or the U.S. having to come to the defense of an ally like the Philippines or Japan or Australia, what have you. And so because the U.S. feels its strategic posture, not just its nuclear weapons, but the policies and capabilities that it would use to project forward in defending allies in either Europe or Asia, because it would be so strained in that type of circumstance, many have advocated that the United States needs to think more about its reliance on nuclear weapons in that sort of second contingency, in this case with China. I guess I'm curious, from your perspective, how much does this idea of sort of multiple conflicts at the same time, how much is that feeding into China's thinking, at least over the course of your research for this book? Because I do think that this is another understudied aspect of how China may be thinking about its posture towards the United States in a limited war scenario. But the idea that a U.S. that may have been involved in a high-end conventional conflict or even a nuclear conflict over Europe is then asked to compete in a crisis that evolves into a conflict in Asia, a bloodied U.S. may be thinking about its policies regarding nuclear first use very differently. And I'm wondering how much you've seen of in whether it's original sources or interviews with Chinese interlocutors, that they've thought about that problem that Washington is trying to grapple with.
So I can say, at the very least, anecdotally, and my fellow panelists may have a different take on this, but I generally see most Chinese analysts reject this kind of three-body problem framing, saying that this is how the United States thinks about it, but the idea that the two countries are going to team up and fight a conflict against the United States, or alternatively that they're going to somehow take the opportunity posed by a weakened United States after a significant conventional conflict with Russia to achieve their aims is just sort of unthinkable from the PRC perspective. And so as a result of that, you also, if you put that into the arms control and the nuclear context, a lot of Chinese analysts will sort of say, well, this three-body problem, the idea from the United States that it needs nuclear forces to deal with both of these contingencies is also invalid and is not something that they accept as a reasonable sort of first principle to govern the nature of the nuclear relationship. I think that this puts the United States in a very difficult position when it thinks about how it's going to set up its nuclear relationships going forward, both from, if you are to think about what's desirable in terms of arms control, it creates difficulties if China says it's invalid that you have nuclear weapons that can deal with both of these contingencies, because that's going to mean China won't accept any sort of an asymmetric sort of asymmetric limits or asymmetric arsenals, perhaps more broadly. But then that leads you pretty much straight into a sort of arms race. And I'll just add one other piece that I think comes out with this, which is that right now I think a lot of Chinese analysts are looking at what's happening with the imminent expiration of the New START treaty next year, and they're basically assuming that the United States is going to end up deploying more strategic warheads as a result of that change because of China's nuclear modernization, and are saying that as a result of that, China needs more nuclear weapons. And so at this point, it then starts to become hard to say, like, who's responsible, who started all of this. You really start to get into that action-reaction spiral where China's saying it needs more nuclear weapons is directly related to an anticipation of how the US is going to proceed with arms control with Russia based on a set of sort of political calculations that at least parts of its community are rejecting. So I think it's a very complex future, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of positive thoughts on how to solve it.
No, and I think one of the challenges the U.S. faces is it's had this nuclear strategy through the Cold War that's overwhelmingly relied on being able to limit damage from Russian nuclear forces. And it's unclear that that mindset really applies to China, given the way that they think about nuclear weapons and strategic capabilities, period, is very different. But how do you wire the US to have two nuclear strategies dependent on different adversaries, I think is a challenge that the strategic community is dealing with right now. Tong, anything you'd like to add on this question?
Sure. In addition to what Fiona already said, I think China basically have a very different threat perception. It doesn't see itself as being aggressive, even teaming up with Russia in a planned joint nuclear aggression against the United States. Its perception is the U.S. has been more hostile and aggressive. So if U.S. conventional forces are stretched thin because of the two-theater dilemma, it would only make the U.S. less aggressive. So that's stabilizing. And yes, that will also put pressure on the United States to rely more on nuclear weapons in the second theater near China. That's, I think, partly why China is strengthening its nuclear capabilities from lower-end theater range nuclear weapons all the way to higher end capabilities to deter the U.S. becoming more interested in threatening nuclear escalation. I think the real risk here is the longer-term arms race implications. So far, the U.S. is already on the verge of seriously considering enhancing U.S. nuclear capabilities, reversing decades of nuclear reduction, primarily or at least partly in response to China's nuclear buildup. But China somehow, I haven't get the sense of concern or sense of urgency in the Chinese expert community that this will harm Chinese interests. We need to do something to make the United States change policy or do not overreact. So it's, I don't know how to explain that. Maybe China becomes more confident. In other words, studying China's nuclear thinking, I'm not sure if Fiona also get the same feeling. I don't see anything unique in China's thinking that would definitely rule out the type of U.S. nuclear policy or options from China's future interest, right? If China indeed, its economic power continues growing, its resources becoming more available, all the U.S. options in damage limitation and managing escalation, nothing prevents China from becoming interested in those options. So maybe this is a time to reflect in general on those options. And when the United States still has clear advantage, setting rules, promote certain norms, I think that could be quite helpful in terms of risk reduction in the future.
Thanks for that. Mallory, anything you want to comment on this, but also I want to dive into this risk reduction topic that's come up a few times given your last job in government and particularly in the last year of the Biden administration where we saw a few things happen that were positive on the U.S.-China discussion front between a statement on AI and NC3 as well as an exchange of notifications related to ballistic missile launches. But anything you'd like to share on this question, and then please lead us off on sort of your perspectives on U.S.-China arms control discussions during your time in ADS.
Yeah, thank you, Pranay. I think it actually stems from Tong's point quite well, that there is a fundamental divide in appreciation, as Fiona pointed out in her book, that and Tong mentioned that Chinese feel that they have been the non-aggressive partner in this relationship, and the U.S. will be talking about a three-body problem that China doesn't take seriously because they don't see that as a potential option on the horizon, just looking at all of their policies, as Fiona did a deep dive on. And I think that is one of the largest risks we face, is this fundamental disconnect. On one side, the U.S. is assuming that this limitless partnership between China and Russia actually means a three-body problem, actually means that China and Russia will gang up on the U.S. if situations allow that, or the Chinese and Russians feel that's in their interest. From the Chinese perspective, I don't know if the limitless partnership was just for show, but it's the kind of thing where it does not seem to reflect their concern that they're in this powerful role, or they're in a more sort of secure aggressor position with that partnership in place. And I think that plays right into a risk reduction challenge where the two sides do not understand how they're looking at the same problem set. There's a complete divergence of appreciation for several aspects of risk reduction, but in the context of who's the aggressor and who is trying to maintain the peace, it's a complete diametric opposite position. But another example of that is the perception that when the U.S. was striving to do arms control, striving to do risk reduction with China during the previous administration, there was a perception from China that it was an attempt to limit China, to hold them back into this subordinate position, potentially, of lower nuclear arsenal, less weapons, a feeling of not as much conventional capability. And one of the aspects of that was the U.S. insistence or push for transparency, right? There's the irony of this transparency concept is that as the U.S. thought it was stabilizing, as the U.S. said, here is our arsenal, here is our transparent policy, this should stabilize the response from those countries that are watching us as aggressors, China responded quite negatively and saw that transparency as aggressive, as an effort at deterrence by highlighting how much weapons the U.S. had, how much power it had. It was almost as if the effort of transparency that the U.S. Really strived for, which we thought the international community would appreciate, backfired in a sense by China stepping back and saying, this is very aggressive to us. This makes us feel less secure, and thus we will not engage in these conversations. As Pranay pointed out, we were able to achieve some success with China after we had one and only engagement with them on risk reduction in November of 2023. We asked them for several things, and at the table, of course, nothing was necessarily accomplished or agreed to, but subsequently we saw some movement in those directions, and one of them being the first missile launch notification of their ballistic missile launch over the Pacific, the first notification of this type of missile launch for over 44 years. And that was one of the things we had discussed in our risk reduction dialogue. This would be useful to notify each other so that we understand these are tests, these are not intended to be directly escalatory. Another request was for keeping a human in the loop in the nuclear decision-making arena, trying to come to some consensus on the risks inherent in AI participation in strategic decision-making. And again, at the table, it wasn't agreed to, and subsequently at the end of the previous administration, there was a very big agreement between the leaders of China and the United States to actually preserve human decision-making capacity in this nuclear decision-making loop. So those are two things. A third thing we talked about at the table during our arms control conversation was greater military-to-military engagement to prevent sort of low-level misunderstanding and miscalculation. And we saw over the course of 2024 a ramp up in those types of military-to-military engagements. A third thing we asked for was greater engagement on perceived space threats that we all faced, regardless of geopolitical position, and it would be a continuation of space security dialogues that had continued from the Obama administration up through Trump 1, and then had stopped during the first Trump administration. And so a request for a continuation of those, also a request for more discussion of chemical and biological risks that we faced. And those were two angles that actually the Chinese government was open to at least understanding where we could discuss mutual perceptions of threat in those arenas. And I think that would have been, and it's something that I think should still be pushed on because it's in both countries' interest to understand our mutual perception. So the risk reduction angle was not immediately accepted at the table, I think because we come at arms control from opposite sides, at least before that November 2023 conversation, the Chinese government's perceptions that we wanted to use arms control to control them and prevent their weapons development. The US perception is the arms control effort was more to prevent unnecessary risks of misunderstanding, miscalculation, and unintentional escalation. So we came at the conversation from different sides, from very much a lack of trust on both sides. And I think as we rolled forward in 2024, we were able to see some of the communications be more effective. And that's why there was a change, both in the performance of the US side and some of the performance on the Chinese side to result in the three change behaviors that we discussed. So what I would take from Fiona's excellent book is that having an appreciation for all sides' efforts to control escalation, to understand how escalation can be managed, would be a useful sort of lead into risk reduction, not a lead in of we must control this weapons program or this weapons program, or we must cap you here and you here, but more of a recognition that escalation management, unintentional escalation prevention is in all countries' interests, and if that can be the means for the conversation, not that we're going to end our sort of leverage points and our escalation dynamics in one fell swoop, but that there should be some capacity to say, we want to avoid this, you want to avoid this. Let's figure out at a very basic fundamental level where our sort of cultural divides are preventing us from achieving a standard level of a meeting of the minds as to where it's in our mutual interest not to misunderstand each other, if that makes sense. So there's a risk reduction element that's inherent in Fiona's book, I think, showing there's a desire to manage escalation, and yet we were not able to capitalize that in a very fulsome way. In the previous administration, I hope from studying this book, we will be able to capture it more fully as this administration goes forward with China.
Thanks, Mallory. Tong, if it were up to you, if you could put a few topics on the table for a risk reduction conversation from a U.S. perspective, what do you think those topics would be? And I think one thing we've observed over the course of the Biden administration was, unless this was orchestrated perfectly in both systems, where it got to a head of state level agreement on what we should all be working on, it was unlikely to result in a really fruitful conversation at lower levels of government. So any ideas that you'd like to convey? I'm sure someone from the new administration is watching us on YouTube.
Yes, and that's actually a central recommendation from Fiona's book. She points out that this conversation going forward is going to increasingly about manipulating risk, at the same time trying to manage unintended risks, right? But you still to intentionally create the right level of risk is central to deterrence effectiveness. So there is a limit to which cooperative measures can do to minimize risk. And that's why I think Fiona's book points out, I think it's the number one recommendation on the list, which is we still need to work on the political disagreements, disputes, problems between the two countries. You have to reduce their interest in manipulating risk in the first place. That's a very important effort that people often ignore or dismiss. But as China becomes more rich in terms of resources and expertise and human capital, it will having greater access to more tools, and it will increasingly develop a more symmetric capability to the United States. There is always the room to engage with China and help China understand, or jointly understand what's the best practice when it comes to new capabilities and postures. Right? China is making significant departures from its traditional nuclear operational strategy. It's increasingly stressing rapid response capability, including its interest in launch under attack capability, if adopted. I think that will represent a major transformation in China's nuclear posture, and will introduce perhaps the greatest risk of nuclear conflict, unintended nuclear conflict, especially for a country that is relatively new to the game of relying on early warning satellites, ground-based radars, and for quickly assessing the scale of enemy incoming attack and the intent behind it, and to quickly come up with a strategy to react in a 10, 20 times a minute's time frame. and perhaps the increasingly felt need to use AI and other advanced technologies to accelerate and facilitate this decision-making under suppressed time frame. The risk of technology of human error or unknown unknowns in all these new systems and postures are something that I think both sides have an interest in minimizing. So U.S. has more experience. It could share some of the best practices, the principles, not the operational details. Those are certainly classified and very sensitive, but I think still there are ways for the U.S. to share best practices at the general level, high-level principles, and they can at least minimize the risks that neither side want.
I guess, Fiona, you can have the last word on this, then we'll go to audience Q&A, but I guess one sort of question that came to mind in discussing risk reduction is, you in this book, you talk about this sort of political imperative to ratify the Test Ban Treaty, all while still dealing with the Taiwan Strait crisis that crossed 95 into 1996. Do you see that sort of desire to be seen as upholding international norms in the non-proliferation arena? Obviously, the sort of increasing confidence, perhaps, as China brings new nuclear capabilities and other strategic capabilities online, as maybe allowing for some of these more fruitful and open discussions to take place, because historically China has used ambiguity or even opacity as a reason not to engage in what we in the US government, at least in our former jobs, consider the kind of way that you do arms control or the way that you talk about risk reduction.
So I think I'll just say one thing about the sort of multilateral context and one about the US-China sort of piece of this. I think if China were the only country that viewed itself as modernizing its nuclear arsenal, then the pressure to sort of be seen as upholding norms and upholding the nuclear security order would be much stronger. But China sees itself as one among a number of official nuclear weapon states that are modernizing their arsenals right now. And so in some ways it's sort of sharing the heat, if you like, for the modernization, even if you might say that, looking at the UK or the United States in comparison, these are a matter of replacement rather than the kinds of qualitative changes that I think Tong pointed to in his remarks. At the same time, though, midway through this year, China did put forward in the NPT review conference preparatory conference structure a multilateral no first use policy. This is a long-standing proposal that China has had on the dial diplomatically, but with a little bit more detail than in previous years. And part of that, I think, was a desire to respond to the sort of pressure on the nuclear weapon states to show progress in their NPT commitments, to make good faith efforts towards disarmament. But the pressure in some ways is shared for China in moving forward in that kind of a multilateral context. I think in the US-China context, I think, we often hear this this adage of, well, China's building up its nuclear capabilities. When it reaches parity, then it's going to talk to us. And I have hesitations about that expectation for two reasons. One of them is that I think in some ways it's pretty optimistic about what China's going to do, even if it reaches very high levels of nuclear weapons. As I point out in the book, and I think is probably obvious to all of us on the panel and many of you in the audience as well, is that China tends to yoke progress on nuclear risk reduction, nuclear arms control, to the broader tenor of the political relationship. And so if the political relationship is in bad shape, don't expect China to engage in nuclear risk reduction, not least nuclear arms control, even if it has the capabilities that put it in a solid position. The second reason why I think the parity and then negotiate expectation could be misleading is because I don't think that parity is actually a meaningful concept for strategic deterrence. Parity is a meaningful concept for gaining the political equality to be able to come to a negotiating table from a position of equality as an equal. But in terms of strategic deterrence, you can gain just as much deterrence efficacy with a smaller or a larger arsenal as your adversary. So parity is not necessary. You might want to have very high levels of retaliatory capability. You may want to have postures that enable you to do certain kinds of things. But parity itself is not the piece that gets you to a place where you feel comfortable that you have enough against your adversary. And so I think I just draw a little caution on the sort of parity and then negotiate piece in the US-China relationship, because I think it's a question of politics, and it is also a question, and just to jump off Mallory's comments as well, that China might not also choose the same content and form for risk reduction and arms control with the United States as the United States is used to from its relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union. And it needs time to sort of figure out how it can maybe get to some of the same places in terms of, for example, launch notification, but it's going to do so tacitly, informally, without setting up a nuclear risk reduction and a formal agreement. And so there needs to be, I think, a little bit of time for China to figure out, whether it's culturally, organizationally, in terms of its practices, what the form is and also what the content is to get us to a slightly less dangerous place.
Thanks for that. And of course, Washington decision makers are famously patient as it relates to nuclear issues these days. So, but we'll take your advice on it. Let's go to audience Q&A. We've got about a half hour left here for the event. I do have a couple of YouTube questions, but if I could start in the room. Does anyone have any questions? We got one over here and one over here.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. My name is Kirsten Asdal. I run a China-focused risk consultancy. And I would like to ask, mostly for Dr. Cunningham, but to all panelists, do you believe, this is off of your most recent comment at the end there, do you believe that party leadership, I guess, does have confidence in its strategic capabilities now to assert strategic deterrence over the U.S.? Or when might it have that? Understanding it's within the context of this strategic substitution, so it would have to have confidence enough that it could do some traditional or conventional move with sufficient backup strategically. Has it reached that point yet? Thank you.
Do you want to kick us off, Fiona?
Sure. I'll break it down into what does China need to get coercive leverage in conventional conflicts, and what does China need for a robust retaliatory capability to deter nuclear attacks, are sort of two components of what we might think strategic deterrence is doing. I think that as China's conventional capabilities have evolved, it needs less leverage from whatever capabilities it's going to choose to threaten escalation in a conflict. And so I think the uncertain pillar of China's strategic substitution is really the cyber pillar. That's the one where you start to see a little bit of questioning as to whether this is really going to give China the conflict overturning outcomes that it has expected, despite the fact that it's also engaged in the Volt Typhoon intrusions over the last sort of 2 years that suggest this is still kind of the game plan. So it's sort of difficult to tell if China thinks that it has enough capability to make a conflict sufficiently dangerous, sufficiently risky for the United States to hesitate about intervening, based on its assessment of how those three capabilities are going and how much it needs to really sort of fill in for as its conventional capabilities have evolved. But I don't see signs that it's running to the nuclear option to deal with problems with that substitution approach. In the nuclear realm, I think it's difficult to say, like, you will not get any Chinese expert tell you, like, this is what we're aiming for and this is what we think is enough. Both for the reasons of opacity and that my co-panelists have mentioned, but also because it sees how much is enough as a moving target based on what the United States is doing, not just with its potential to increase the size of deployed strategic nuclear weapons, but also in the non-nuclear space. So there is Chinese analysts will often point to improvements in US sensing capabilities to find China's mobile missiles. There is also a Golden Dome proposal to increase the comprehensiveness of US missile defense. And so all of those changes outside of the nuclear domain also lift the threshold for China for how much is enough. So I think it's certainly more confident than it was in the past, but whether it is confident that it has a comfortable margin for error to withstand any of the shocks that come from technological choices the US might have going forward is a little bit trickier to say.
Tong or Mallory, anything you'd like to add? Tong, come to you first.
I'm happy to add comment because I think this is a very important question. And it's important because I don't think China has a clear thinking on this. Right? If you look at, I fully agree what Fiona has said in the book, but if you look at the major turning points after which China decided to double down on information age weapons development because of the felt or perceived need for coercive leverage, right? All these Chinese development of information age weapons are driven by the leverage deficit, as called by Fiona. But if you look at many of the crises, the turning points, those are not military crises exactly. Those are political crises, right? The embassy bombing in Belgrade, that's just one incident, right? There was no military action, counteraction, and as well as the 2022 Nancy Pelosi visit, after which Fiona said in the book, it might further prompt China to develop more future tools for coercive leverage. But again, that was a political crisis. There was no military action, counter-military action. So it's unclear why Chinese leaders concluded that with some new type of weapons, those crises would turn out differently. Right? It's unlike if China had more precise conventional missiles or better counter-space weapons, China would be able to somehow influence those political crisis developments and leading to different results. So I think it's unclear in China's thinking how is actually the lack of political leverage and what military tools can translate into the desired political leverage. That is never clear in the Chinese thinking. So that's why it's particularly hard to answer the question, how much will be sufficient?
The great point. Mallory?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's never a static moment in the arms racing of leverage, security, feelings, deterrence. There's always, sometimes a country may lag. In fact, I think the US feels as if we may have lagged on our sort of nuclear modernization or our nuclear deterrence angle, and thus we need to rush to catch up. I think if any country feels too sort of secure, there's usually a backlash of, oh, well, all these other countries were building up their own leverage, building up their own capacities, responding to our potential perceived advantages with their own ability to protect and prevent the effectiveness of those advantages. So it's a constant, right? It's a constant race. It's a constant moving target. And so I think that China is very aware right now of needing to sort of fill in potential holes or to continue to strive to be able to protect itself and project power. And that's why we see, again, the exponential increase of its nuclear arsenal, right? If it felt secure in its positioning, why would it feel the need to do that across the board? Why would it develop these strategic substitutions? Why would it look to continue a lot of the maneuvering it's doing in various regions around the world if it felt sort of comfortable in its positioning? And I think most countries don't feel comfortable for very long in this sort of geopolitical struggle at the strategic level. And so even if there was a pause or a delay in some of these programs, I think ultimately there's a constant feeling of what the next leverage angle will come from.
That's great. Thank you. This gentleman right here.
Lawrence Freeman. I'm an independent consultant. I do work on geopolitical issues. In terms of recent developments, so President Trump in his discussions on Ukraine-Russia war has said nuclear war is the worst thing we face, World War III. He's said it pretty boldly, whether you agree with his analysis of the situation. So is that something he's proposed, actually, a meeting for Russia, China, and the US to discuss the reduction of nuclear weapons? First, how would you think China is going to respond to that? Second of all, from the Chinese standpoint, if I understand it, I'm not the expert you are, they believe that their first effort was to achieve economic parity and development, and then now they're putting money into expansion of the military capability in the PLA. Is it possible that China, even without Russia and U.S., maybe under Trump, Biden made China the enemy that built up our huge $1 trillion budget? Trump seems to be going in a different direction. Is it possible China and the U.S. could reach an agreement that escalation of nuclear war is not in their interest and they each would rather spend the money making each one of their countries great again?
Fiona, why don't you take the first crack at it?
So I'll take the first crack. I think that, so I mean, I'm recently returned from China, so I can perhaps say that comment was made while I was actually in Beijing. And I think people are very curious. They're listening. They're constantly looking out for these kinds of cues to see where are the opportunities for us to make progress on arms control? What is the Trump administration's attitude towards nuclear arms racing going to be? On the one hand, we see, expectations of continuity. We see people who could be considered China hawks in the administration. But on the other hand, they know that Trump is a deal maker. Trump can be potentially quite, unpredictable in the choices that he's going to make, and that can generate these kinds of opportunities to really sort of shake things up in a good way. At the same time, though, they're wary of, how much stock should we put in these kinds of statements for all of the reasons that I just stated, right? That the trends are pushing in both directions. And I think one of the other pieces of this is one of the first things the administration did was to announce that it was going to pursue a more comprehensive missile defense capability. And that really plays on one of China, and I should say Russia's worst nightmares when it comes to arms racing and the stability of their nuclear forces. So you're really sort of seeing things pull in opposite directions. And I think from China's perspective and the US's perspective as well, one of the issues is always going to be how do we think of the priorities between managing nuclear risks and the risks of the use of nuclear war and ensuring that our political objectives are protected, right? Because nuclear weapons, for both countries do help them protect some of their most kind of core and important political interests. And so thinking about where those priorities are going to sit, I think, is one of the issues in the US-China relationship, because thus far, I think the United States puts the risk of nuclear war as perhaps a greater concern than China sometimes does. But China, I think, is certainly looking, at least diplomatically, where can they move next after the P5 statement in February of 2022 that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, a statement that Xi Jinping repeated with a number of different leaders, including President Biden, but really sort of thinking about where can that agenda go next, while at the same time not renouncing the buildup of their own forces to ensure that the nuclear weapons deliver that kind of security for their interests that they feel is essential.
Others?
I'm happy to jump in. I think from China's perspective, militarily, it benefits China to prevent nuclear escalation because of growing Chinese conventional military advantage, at least in the Asia-Pacific theater. So that's why I think partly China has been promoting no first use agreements, etc. It's the United States now faces, I think, more pressure to consider threatening nuclear escalation in a future regional war with China. Regarding Trump's talk about China, Russia, U.S. nuclear, denuclearization, I think the first message Trump administration's overall approach has sent to Beijing is it's a world. Going forward, the world is going to be increasingly a world ruled by the law of the jungle. It's might makes right, because the way the Trump administration so far has dealt with issues of Ukraine war, dealt with allies, dealt with Russia. To Trump, what is really important is how many cards you have. What is card? Card is your material capability to make a difference, right? So that reinforces Chinese belief that what really matters eventually is your material capability. And anything else can change. So I think that reinforces China's commitment to long-term development or even greater military capability in general, including nuclear. The second factor is, as Fiona mentioned, huge uncertainty with Trump administration. Firstly, huge uncertainty after Trump administration. We know that Trump administration is perhaps only last 4 years. What happens after that is hugely uncertain. It could be reversed quickly. In that case, any nuclear arms agreement with Trump administration wouldn't be sustainable. So why would China, seriously negotiating with Trump administration? And secondly, the uncertainty within Trump administration. Right? Trump is very different from the Trump administration. The DoD's #1 priority right now is to cut other programs but focus on the China threat. But Trump himself is sending a different message. He doesn't necessarily see China as a threat. He talks about nuclear disarmament, 50% defense budget cut. So the internal debate and tension and inconsistency is huge. So that encourage China to just wait out and see what really happens. This also is true for all the major big items like Golden Dome. It's going to be so expensive and technologically challenging. I think China now has the confidence and patience to wait out and see what really materializes before becoming really concerned about the consequences and jumping on to the nuclear negotiating talk. But I think the more positive scenario is if China thinks Trump personally is really interested in nuclear arms control and talks about nuclear weapons. If Trump persistently pressing this issue, I think that might get Chinese attention. Mm-hmm. And I think China is increasingly open to a bigger bargain with the Trump administration, including trade, economic, and maybe other core interests like Taiwan or South China Sea. And if that is increasingly appears possible, China might throw into nuclear arms control talk as a sweetener to get concessions from other core issues. In that sense, I see the greater possibility of a general discussion of nuclear weapon issues without any sense of urgency on the part of Beijing to push for concrete agreements.
Thanks, Tong. I mean, it's a good point. If the new administration is willing to expand the sort of trade basket, if you will, to include military infrastructure in the region or exercises or those types of things that I think would have been considered taboo in the last administration, then maybe that entices this type of discussion. So Mallory, in your last job, you had a lot of experience trying to get Chinese diplomats to the center on many issues, including in multilateral fora like the P5, First Committee, et cetera. We've got an NPT preparatory committee meeting coming up. As Fiona outlined, sort of no first use political statement is one of the things that China will be advancing. Do you think we'll see reflections on this proposal by the president for a trilateral architecture at the PrepCom? And if so, how do you think it will be discussed among some of your former colleagues who will be there in New York?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tong is exactly right that there's a lot of confusion right now as to what the focus of this administration will be. I think there's been some inconsistent messaging. There's been, certainly less focus on rules-based international order, less focus on sort of following traditional normative approaches to regulating AI or space arena, right? We've seen this administration, I think, to a certain degree, change its approach to some of the normative and rules-based approaches that the previous administration took. So, Tong's point that this is sort of a might makes right is a challenging, I think, perception for other countries to interpret, to understand if there's a possibility to cooperate or if it's just now a sheer arms race or a sheer sort of race to see who is the strongest. That said, you're exactly right, and I think we've reflected some of the confusing statements about where the sort of president is himself versus potentially where some on his cabinet or where Congress is with respect to their approach to China. The president has repeatedly talked about denuclearization. We saw him say that several times in Davos, and then continue sort of to make mention of the massive amounts of money that we pour into our nuclear arsenal. So that is potentially a good sort of lead into a basis for a conversation on nuclear risk reduction. It's potentially helpful in the NPT context, but I think the overwhelming response right now, potentially in the absence of clear-cut policies or clear-cut approaches, is confusion, right? I just think that at least some that I've spoken with internationally are trying to interpret the very different messages that they're hearing, that they're seeing, that they're sort of viewing playing out amongst the Trump administration, but also amongst the U.S. government and its allies. So I think there's a lot of open questions, but I certainly agree with you, Pranay, that if the aperture is opened as to what could be discussed, both on the part of China and understanding what they would be willing to discuss at the table, as well as from the Trump administration and from Russia, there is a potential to at least find some commonality between the three countries. And I think that's where there could be some cause for hopeful outlooks. But I think right now in the context of very many different narratives and messages, it's very hard to see how you crystallize that into something that's positive moving forward.
Great, and as students of history know, combining the pursuit of an impenetrable missile defense shield with an offer of strategic offensive arms reductions is not a new playbook. It is something that was tried once before, albeit in a very different time where China's nuclear arsenal and strategic capabilities were much lesser than they are today. Let's go to the internet for a question, and if others have questions in the audience, please get them prepared as we're running out of time. And it's a cyber question. So, Fiona, I'll come to you first. Based on the PRC's theory of escalation and information warfare, what role will cyber warfare play in a Taiwan contingency? And how can the U.S. and Taiwan prepare? And I think that this would be something that allies would want to prepare for as well.
So it is a question that I look at in the book, examining the PRC sort of doctrine, organization, signaling, and capabilities insofar as they're observable in the cyber arena. But I think that there has long been an understanding within China that offensive cyber operations can have a certain type of psychological effect, a strategic effect on decision makers, because they can create paralysis, chaos among an adversary's society, and then shape adversary decision makers' responses. In addition to that, one of the other sort of key ways in which China's doctrinal writings deal with large-scale offensive cyber operations is to describe how they can also be used to attack the command and control networks that allow countries, adversary militaries, to sort of piece together different parts of their systems, and hence reduce the effectiveness of the way that they can use information to fight the sort of contemporary joint operations that we would expect the US and its allies to be fighting if there were a Taiwan contingency. So you might sort of translate that into thinking that you will have some sort of an attempt to use offensive cyber operations to shape US decision-making, delay US responses early on in a conflict, and that you might see relatively similar types of operations also leveled at Taiwan. And if we look at some of China's cyber behavior as well, so recently large-scale revelations of the Volt Typhoon intrusions into both US as well as allied critical infrastructure, and the US government believes that this is intended to shape or slow down a US response if there is any crisis decision-making. What I think is interesting, though, is that you see, as of 2015 onwards, a greater interest in China in thinking about what they call managing serious cyberspace crises, not using these capabilities in reckless and sort of uncontrolled ways that are going to generate uncontrolled risks of escalation because of the way that those cyber operations are conducted. So there's that sort of desire to sort of keep things controlled. And so that leads to the question of whether China would automatically go about attempting to disable all of the infrastructure that it has penetrated immediately, or whether it would be looking at a more kind of tiered or graded effort to generate escalatory pressure in cyberspace. I will say this is the one force posture of China's information age weapons, where it doesn't use a particular type of term about generating escalatory momentum that you see in both the conventional missile as well as the cyber portions, that suggest to me that how exactly you generate this kind of tiered approach or controlled approach to escalation using cyber operations is either absent or is still under development within the PRC. So that's sort of the manner of using these capabilities. I think in terms of responses for the Taiwanese as well as the United States, one of the most obvious things that you want to do is to prepare. The US now has a cyber doctrine that involves trying to disrupt these kinds of operations before they're conducted. So find the malware, get it out of your system, try and avoid it from getting back in there, so that you've essentially taken away China's ability to engage in these attacks before they begin. And maybe they'll continue to try to do it again through different types of accesses and options. But still, it's about creating more friction and difficulty for the PRC in preparing in that manner. Of course, some things will slip through the cracks. So the other piece there would be preparing to make sure that you can quickly get these networks back up and running if data is wiped on them or if they are in any way disabled. And I think that's probably particularly important from the Taiwanese perspective, is working on the resilience piece, but also to the extent that is permissible, working with partners in their private sector. In the kind of model, if you look at what happened with the Ukraine conflict, that really blunted the Russian efforts to use cyber operations to change the course of the conflict, to really put a lot of pressure on Ukrainian decision makers. The assistance of the private sector and NATO countries made a big difference in preventing Russia from having that impact, and that's something the PLA has sort of noticed and is watching to see what the future of cyber operations holds, and in particular, what kinds of preparations led to less Russian success and more Ukrainian and allied success.
Thank you for that. So we are right at time here, and I want to thank our panelists for participating, particularly Fiona. Thank you for your important contribution here. Fiona's book is out in the hallway on sale for $21, a steal given paper prices these days. So buy it, get it signed, and I hope you all enjoy this contribution as much as we did, and took something away from this conversation that'll help you as you read through Fiona's book. So with that, please join me in thanking our panel today.